The hair strand was barely visible against the evidence bag's white paper, translucent brown, kinked in the middle, where it had been torn from the root. Detective Sarah Chen held it up to the fluorescent light of the cold case unit at 11:47 p.m., watching how it caught the glow. 42 years it had waited in a box. 42 years since someone ripped it from their scalp during a violent struggle. 42 years since Maria Gonzalez had fought for her life. The email notification chimed. DNA match found. CODIS hit. 99.9% probability. Sarah clicked it open, her coffee growing cold in her hand. The name on the screen made her stomach drop. Frank Morrison, age 68. Current address, 1247 Desert Vista Drive, Tucson. 2 blocks from where Maria had lived. 2 blocks from where she'd walked every single day. Sarah's hands started shaking. She'd driven past that house 3 times this week. What nobody knew yet was that Frank Morrison had attended Maria's funeral in 1982. He'd stood in the back row, head bowed while her students sang Amazing Grace. He'd brought flowers to her grave every year on the anniversary of her death. And he'd driven a school bus full of children for another 23 years after he killed her. The monster had been hiding in plain sight for 4 decades. The desert sun turned everything amber on October 14, 1982. It was that perfect autumn temperature when Tucson exhaled after the brutal summer 78 degrees. Dry, with a breeze that carried the scent of creosote. Bush across the neighborhoods near Saguaro National Park. Maria Gonzalez locked the door of her 3rd grade classroom at Davis Elementary School at 3:47 p.m. She was 28 years old, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders and a laugh that made her students feel safe. She wore a yellow sundress that day, her favorite, the one with tiny white flowers embroidered along the hem. Her fiancé, David Reyes, had bought it for her at the mall the previous weekend. "See you Monday, Miss Gonzalez?" 8-year-old Jennifer Hartley waved from her mother's car in the parking lot. Maria waved back, her engagement ring catching the light. 3 months. In 3 months, she'd be Mrs. Reyes. She'd already picked out her dress, booked the church, sent the invitations. David would be home from his engineering conference in Phoenix tonight, and they were going to finalize the seating chart over dinner. She slung her canvas bag over her shoulder heavy, with ungraded spelling tests and a borrowed copy of Where the Red Fern Grows she was going to read to her class next week. She'd walked this route home 847 times. Exactly 2 miles from the school to her apartment on Cale, Montana. 26 minutes if she didn't stop. She stopped that day at the corner store where she always bought Diet Coke. The clerk, Mr. Patel, would remember her smile. Her exact words, "Beautiful afternoon, isn't it? Days like this, I'm so glad I moved to Tucson." Those were the last words anyone heard Maria Gonzalez speak. She left the store at 4:12 p.m., security footage grainy. Black and white showed her walking west on Speedway Boulevard, her sundress moving in the breeze. The footage cut off at the edge of the frame. She never made it home. David Reyes called at 6:30 p.m. No answer. He called again at 7 o'clock. Then 7:30. By 8 o'clock, he was in his car, driving the 2 hours from Phoenix. His hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. He arrived at her apartment at 10:15 p.m. Her car sat in its spot, undisturbed. Her mailbox was empty. She'd checked it before leaving for school that morning. He had a key. He let himself in. Everything was exactly as she'd left it that morning. Coffee mug in the sink. Bed made with military precision. Wedding binder open on the kitchen table to the catering page. David called the police at 10:47 p.m. Missing person report. Adult female, 28 years old, responsible. Never disappeared before, supposed to be home hours ago. The dispatcher was sympathetic, but not concerned. "Sir, it's been less than 6 hours. She's an adult. She could be with friends." "Could have gone to the store. You don't understand?" David said, his voice cracking. "Maria doesn't just disappear. Something's wrong. Something's very wrong." What he didn't know was that at that exact moment, Maria's body lay in the darkness of Saguaro National Park, 3 miles from her apartment. The desert night had turned cold. Coyotes were already circling. The search began at dawn on October 15th. Tucson Police Department sent 2 officers to canvass the neighborhood. They showed Maria's photo, her school ID picture, smiling. Professional to everyone on her route home. No one had seen anything unusual. Detective James Moreland caught the case. He was 43, balding, with a gut that hung over his belt and 20 years of experience that made him more cynical than hopeful. Missing women in their 20s usually meant one of 3 things: voluntary disappearance, domestic situation, or the worst-case scenario. He interviewed David first. Standard procedure. Boyfriend, fiancé, husband always start close and work outward. David sat in the interview room at the station, his eyes red from no sleep, his engineering conference badge still clipped to his polo shirt. "I was in Phoenix," he kept saying. "There's footage. The hotel has cameras. I was at a dinner meeting from 6 to 8:30. There are 12 witnesses." Moreland believed him. You learn to read people in this job. David Reyes was devastated, not guilty. His alibi would check out. "Tell me about Maria," Moreland said, softening his tone. "Help me understand who she was." David's voice broke. She was light, you know? Like, she made everything better just by being there. Her students loved her. She volunteered at the animal shelter every Saturday. She wanted 3 kids. We were going to buy a house in the foothills. He paused. "She was the best person I've ever known." Moreland wrote it all down, but he was thinking statistics. 73% of missing women who disappear without a trace in the first 24 hours are found dead. By hour 48, it's 91%. They were already at hour 16. Frank Morrison heard about the missing teacher on his car. Radio at 6:45 a.m. while driving to the school bus depot. He was 26 years old, stocky, with thinning blonde hair and hands that gripped the steering wheel too tight. Tucson police are asking for information about Maria Gonzalez, 28, an elementary school teacher who disappeared yesterday afternoon while walking home. Frank changed the station. Found music. Leonard Skynyrd, Sweet Home, Alabama. He sang along, his voice slightly off-key. He arrived at the depot at 7:10 a.m., the same time he did every weekday morning. He picked up Route 7 Betha Elementary School route. Same route he'd driven for 3 years. He knew every stop, every kid's name, every parent's face. Morning, Frank. Susan Martinez, another driver, called from her bus. Morning, Sue. Frank waved, smiling that easy smile that made everyone like him. Dependable Frank. Friendly Frank. Frank who always volunteered to take extra shifts, who kept his bus spotless, who never missed a day. The first child climbed on his bus at 7:32 a.m. Jennifer Hartley, 8 years old, pigtails bouncing. "Mr. Frank, did you hear about Miss Gonzalez? She's missing. Everyone's talking about it." Frank's smile didn't waver. "I'm sure she'll turn up, sweetheart. Probably just got her days mixed up or something. Don't you worry." But his hands were shaking on the wheel. What Jennifer didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Frank Morrison had 12 scratches on his left forearm, hidden under his long-sleeved uniform shirt. Deep ones. The kind that came from fingernails fighting for survival. He'd scrubbed them with peroxide that morning until they bled again. He'd wrapped them in gauze. He told himself it would be fine. No one had seen anything. It had been dark. The park was isolated. It would be fine. They found Maria Gonzalez at 2:37 p.m. on October 15th. A park ranger named Thomas Webb was doing a routine check of the trails in Saguaro National Park's east section when his dog, Ranger, a 3-year-old German Shepherd, went berserk at a cluster of Palo Verde trees. About 40 yards off the main path, Thomas followed. The desert floor was rocky, dotted with saguaro cacti standing like sentries. The smell hit him before he saw her. Maria lay face down in a shallow depression behind the trees, partially covered with brush and rocks. Her yellow sundress was torn. Her canvas bag was 30 feet away, its contents scattered spelling tests, lifting slightly in the wind like fallen leaves. Thomas radioed it in with a voice that shook despite his training. "I've got a body. Female. East section. Mile marker 7. Need homicide and crime scene." Detective Moreland arrived 23 minutes later. The scene would burn itself into his memory for the rest of his life. Maria had been beaten. Blunt force trauma to the back of her skull. The medical examiner would later determine 3 separate impacts. The killer had used a rock they found it 6 feet away, approximately 5 pounds, granite, covered in blood and hair. Time of death, somewhere between 4:30 and 6 p.m. On October 14th, there was evidence of a struggle. Defensive wounds on her hands, torn fingernails, and caught in her right hand, clutched so tightly they had to pry her fingers open 3 strands of hair, brown, kinked, with roots still attached. The killer's DNA. Waiting. But DNA analysis in 1982 was science fiction. The first DNA profiling wouldn't be used in a criminal case until 1986. CODISTA, combined DNA index system, wouldn't exist until 1998, so they bagged the hair. They logged it as evidence item 47B. They stored it in a box in a temperature-controlled room at the Tucson Police Department, and there it sat for 42 years. David Reyes identified Maria's body at 6:15 p.m. that evening. They'd cleaned her up as best they could, covered the trauma, but he knew. He knew the moment they pulled back the sheet. He made a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like something breaking. The chaplain who accompanied him said later, "It was the worst sound he'd ever heard a human make." Maria's parents flew in from El Paso that night. Carla and Roberto Gonzalez, both in their 50s, holding each other up as they walked into the police station. Their only daughter. Their baby. The teacher, the good girl, the one who called home every Sunday without fail. Who did this? Roberto asked Detective Moreland. His English was accented but clear. His eyes were hollow. "Who killed my daughter? We're going to find them," Moreland promised. It was the promise every detective makes. It was the promise he meant with everything in him. It was the promise that would haunt him for the rest of his career. The investigation consumed Tucson for weeks. Davis Elementary School held a memorial. 300 people came. Children sobbed. Parents hugged each other. Maria's classroom remained empty, a substitute covering her students. Because nobody could bring themselves to pack up her things yet. Her desk still had that day's date written on the chalkboard. October 14th, 1982. Where the Red Fern Grows book sat on her desk. Bookmark at Chapter 3, Detective Moreland worked 18-hour days. They interviewed 127 people. Every neighbor on Maria's route home. Every parent at the school. Every teacher. Every business owner along Speedway Boulevard. They analyzed the evidence. The rock had no fingerprints wiped clean, or the killer had worn gloves. The hair strands were logged and preserved, but without DNA technology, they were nearly useless. They could determine color that they'd been forcibly removed, that they likely belonged to a male, but that was it. They had no witnesses. No one had seen Maria after she left the corner store. A 2-mile walk through a residential neighborhood, and somehow, invisibly, someone had abducted her, driven her 3 miles to a national park, and killed her. Moreland developed a profile. Male, likely 20 to 40 years old, strong enough to overpower a healthy woman. Familiar with the area, possibly knew Maria's routine. The crime showed planning the isolated location, the time of day when the park had few visitors, the ability to transport her without being seen. But knowing the profile and finding the killer were two different things. The leads dried up by December. The FBI got involved briefly but had nothing to add. No similar crimes in the database. No pattern. This appeared to be an isolated incident, which somehow made it worse. David Reyes left Tucson in January 1983. He couldn't stay. Every street corner reminded him of Maria. He moved to Seattle, tried to start over, never really succeeded. He never married. Never stopped loving the woman in the yellow sundress. Maria's parents buried their daughter in El Paso. They visited her grave every week until they both died. Roberto from a heart attack in 1994. Carla from cancer in 2003. Both went to their graves not knowing who had murdered their child. The case went cold in the summer of 1983. Not officially, but practically. Moreland kept the file on his desk, kept following leads that went nowhere, but new cases came in. Resources shifted. Life moved on. Everyone moved on except Maria. Frozen at 28 in a yellow sundress. With wedding plans and spelling tests and a whole life, she never got to live. The years passed like sand through fingers. Detective Moreland got promoted to sergeant. The Maria Gonzalez's file moved from his desk to a filing cabinet. The first DNA profiling was successfully used to solve a murder in England. Moreland read about it in a police journal. He thought about evidence item 47B. He made a note to follow up. He never did. Technology was still too new, too expensive, too experimental. Frank Morrison married a woman named Linda Hayes. She was a kindergarten teacher, sweet-faced, with a laugh like wind chimes. They had a small wedding at a Methodist church. Frank wore a gray suit. He smiled in all the photos. On their honeymoon, Linda mentioned how gentle Frank was, how safe he made her feel. Frank and Linda had their first child, a daughter. They named her Emma. Frank held her in the hospital, his rough hands impossibly careful, and cried tears of joy. He was, by all accounts, a wonderful father. Detective Moreland retired. The Maria Gonzalez case ate at him like acid. In his retirement speech, he mentioned it. "The ones you don't solve," he said, "those are the ones that stay with you." Maria Gonzalez deserved justice. "I'm sorry I couldn't give it to her." The file transferred to the cold case unit. A new detective, younger, skimmed through it. Interesting case. Brutal, sad, but cold cases with no DNA matches. No witnesses, no leads. Those were needle in a haystack territory. He moved on to cases with better odds. CODIS launched nationally. The Combined DNA Index System, a FBI database that would eventually hold millions of DNA profiles from convicted offenders and crime scenes. Police departments across the country started entering old evidence. Tucson PD began the process. Thousands of pieces of evidence. Slow work, underfunded, understaffed. Evidence item 47B from the Maria Gonzalez case sat in its box. Not yet prioritized. The hair strands waited. Frank Morrison retired from his school bus driver job after 23 years of service. The district threw him a party, gave him a plaque for dedicated service to the children of Tucson. Dozens of parents and former students attended. Everyone loved Frank. He moved to a modest house on Desert Vista Drive, 2 blocks from where Maria Gonzalez used to live. Sometimes he'd drive past her old apartment building, Sometimes he'd wonder if anyone remembered. Sometimes, late at night, he could still feel her fingernails raking down his arm. Linda Morrison died of breast cancer. Frank was devastated. He'd nursed her through 2 years of treatment, held her hand during chemo, been there at the end. At her funeral, people whispered about what a devoted husband he'd been. How much he'd loved her. How tragic it all was. Frank visited Linda's grave every Sunday. Right after he visited Maria's, DNA technology advanced exponentially. What took weeks in 1998 took hours. What cost thousands cost hundreds. Cold cases around the country started cracking open. Killers from the 60s, 70s, 80s suddenly caught because of a cigarette butt. A hair strand, a drop of blood preserved decades ago. Tucson PD increased cold case funding. Started systematically entering old evidence into CODIS. They had a backlog of 847 cases. They worked chronologically. Maria Gonzalez, case number 821847. Was on the list. It would take them 14 more years to get there. Detective Sarah Chen joined Tucson PD's cold case unit in January 2024. She was 36, sharp-minded, with a personal reason for specializing in unsolved murders. Her own aunt had been killed in a home invasion in San Diego when Sarah was 12. They never caught the killer. The not knowing had destroyed her family like a slow poison. Sarah's first week, her supervisor, Lieutenant Marcus Webson of the ranger who'd found Maria's body, gave her a stack of files. "These are the priority cases," he said. "Evidence logged, DNA available, just waiting for analysis. Start with the oldest. Maria Gonzalez was third on the list." Sarah read the file in her cubicle, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. The crime scene photos made her wince. The victim photo, the school ID, Maria smiling, made her angry. 28, engaged. Whole life ahead. Gone in a moment of violence, she read Detective Moreland's notes, meticulous, thorough. A good detective working a cold trail. She felt a kinship with him across the decades. She pulled evidence item 47B from storage on February 3, 2024. The box had aged cardboard, slightly yellowed, tape brittle. Inside, the evidence bag was intact. The 3 hair strands still visible against the white paper, preserved perfectly in controlled temperature. Sarah hand-delivered it to the Arizona DPS crime lab. "Rush this if you can," she told the forensic analyst, a woman named Dr. Patricia Flores. Victim was 28. Family deserves closure. Dr. Flores nodded. She understood. They all understood. This job wasn't just about science. It was about giving peace to the living and justice to the dead. The DNA extraction process took 2 weeks. 42-year-old hair samples were challenging. Degradation, contamination risks, sample size limitations. But Dr. Flores was one of the best. She isolated viable DNA from the root bulbs of 2 of the 3 hairs. Male. DNA, not the victims. Presumably. The killers, they entered it into CODIS on March 2, 2024. The search was automated. Comparing the profile against 14.3 million offender profiles and 3.8 million forensic profiles in the database, nothing, no match. Sarah's heart sank when she got the email. Another dead end? The killer's DNA wasn't in the system, which meant they'd never been convicted of a felony. Never been arrested in a state that mandated DNA collection. But Dr. Flores wasn't done. "We can try genetic genealogy," she suggested. "Upload to GetMatch, build a family tree, triangulate." It was the new frontier of cold case investigation. The method that had caught the Golden State Killer in 2018. Time-consuming, painstaking, but effective. Sarah got approval. They uploaded the DNA profile to GetMatch. a public genetic genealogy database where people uploaded their recreational DNA tests to find relatives. The initial matches came back on March 15th. Distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared a common ancestor with the killer somewhere in the 1800s. Sarah hired a genetic genealogist, a specialist named Dr. Martin Chen, no relation. He was a gray-haired man in his 60s who worked from home in California, building family trees from DNA matches and historical records. The work took months. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, census records, obituaries, building family trees backward and forward in time. Identifying common ancestors, tracking descendants, narrowing the pool. By July, they had a focus. A specific family line that connected multiple DNA matches. The suspect's great-great-grandfather was a man named Robert Morrison. Born in Kansas in 1882, died in Arizona in 1957. By August, they'd narrowed it to 3 possible candidates. Men of the right age, living in Tucson in 1982, descended from Robert Morrison. Frank Morrison was one of them. Sarah sat at her desk on August 23, 2024, looking at Frank Morrison's photo. Driver's license, current. Age 68. White hair, soft face, gentle eyes. He lived on Desert Vista Drive. She pulled his records. Clean, no criminal history, not even a speeding ticket. Retired school bus driver. Widower. 1 adult daughter. Model citizen, but he'd lived 2 blocks from Maria Gonzalez in 1982. He'd been 26 years old. Right age range. Right area. And his DNA matched. Sarah's pulse quickened. This was it. After 42 years, this was the break. She needed more. DNA from GEDmatch was investigative, not evidentiary. She needed a direct sample from Frank Morrison to confirm the match in a way that would hold up in court. She couldn't just ask him for a DNA swab. Not yet. That would tip him off, so she followed him. For 3 weeks, Sarah and her partner, Detective Luis Martinez, surveilled Frank Morrison. They watched him from unmarked cars, documented his routine. Grocery store on Tuesday mornings, library on Wednesday afternoons, diner for breakfast every Sunday. He was alone most of the time. His daughter Emma visited once a week. He seemed lonely, ordinary, harmless, but Sarah had learned long ago that monsters rarely look like monsters. On September 12th, Frank Morrison went to his regular diner for breakfast. He ordered coffee, pancakes, orange juice. He ate slowly, read the newspaper, left a generous tip. After he left, Sarah went in. She wore regular clothes, jeans, t-shirt, not her detective attire. She sat at his booth, ordered coffee. And when the busboy came to clear Frank's table, Sarah slipped him a $50 bill. "I need that coffee cup," she said quietly. "Evidence in an investigation. I'm a police detective. Don't touch the rim. Use gloves." The busboy's eyes went wide, but he nodded. 5 minutes later, he handed her a paper evidence bag with Frank Morrison's coffee cup inside. Sealed, untouched. Sarah took it straight to the lab. The wait was agony. DNA analysis took days. Sarah couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. She kept thinking about Maria, about David Reyes in Seattle. Now 58 years old, probably still thinking about the woman in the yellow sundress. About Maria's parents, dead without ever knowing justice. The results came back on September 18, 2024. At 2:47 p.m., DNA from the coffee cup matched DNA from evidence item. 47 bites with 99.9% certainty Frank Morrison had killed Maria Gonzalez. Sarah called a meeting with the district attorney, Lieutenant Webb, and her partner Martinez. They gathered in a conference room at 4 p.m. The evidence file spread across the table. "We've got him," Sarah said. DNA match confirmed. Frank Morrison, age 68, killed Maria Gonzalez in 1982. He lived 2 blocks from her. He was a school bus driver. He's been hiding in plain sight for 42 years. The DA, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Brooks, reviewed the evidence. The original crime scene report. The hair samples. The DNA analysis. The genealogy tree. The coffee cup match. Solid, she said. We can file charges. First-degree murder. No statute of limitations. Lieutenant Webb leaned back in his chair. His father had found Maria's body. He'd grown up hearing the story. What's Morrison's routine? How do we approach this? Carefully, Sarah said. He's 68. No weapons registered to him. No indication of flight risk. He's lived in the same house for 20 years. But he killed once. We don't know what he's capable of now. They planned the arrest for dawn. September 20th, 2024. A team of 6 officers. SWAT on standby, arrest warrant signed. Sarah didn't sleep the night before. She kept thinking about Maria. About how this moment, this arrest, was 42 years overdue. About how justice delayed was still justice. About how the dead deserved to be remembered. They knocked on Frank Morrison's door at 6:07 a.m. The sun was just starting to rise over the Tucson desert, turning the sky pink and gold. The air was cool, that perfect autumn temperature that Maria had loved. Frank answered, wearing a bathrobe. His white hair messy from sleep, confusion on his face. Yes, can I help you? Sarah held up her badge. Frank Morrison. I'm Detective Sarah Chen, Tucson PD. We have a warrant for your arrest. His face went pale. For just a moment, less than a second, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, fear, resignation, then it was gone. Replaced by confusion. I'm sorry, what? There must be some mistake. I haven't done anything. You're under arrest for the murder of Maria Gonzalez on October 14, 1982. The name hit him like a physical blow. He actually staggered back a step. I don't. His voice failed him. They handcuffed him on his front porch. Read him his rights. Put him in the back of the squad car. Neighbors watched from windows, shocked. Frank Morrison. That sweet old man who brought cookies at Christmas. Who helped carry groceries for the elderly woman next door. At the station, Sarah put him in an interview room. Standard space table, 2 chairs. Camera in the corner, mirror on one wall. Frank sat with his handcuffed hands on the table, staring at nothing. Sarah let him sit for 30 minutes. Let him think. Let him sweat. When she entered with Martinez, Frank looked up with red-rimmed eyes. I want a lawyer. Smart, guilty people who knew how the system worked always asked for lawyers immediately. That's your right, Sarah said calmly. But before we stop talking, I want you to know something. We have your DNA, Frank, from Maria's hand. She scratched you when you were killing her. She held your hair in her fist when she died. We matched it. It's over. Frank's face crumpled. For a moment, Sarah thought he might confess. 42 years was a long time to carry that weight. Maybe part of him wanted it over, but he just whispered, lawyer. The interview ended. The media exploded. Cold case solved after 42-year school bus driver arrested for 1982 murder. It was national news within hours. CNN, Fox, MSNBC. The story had everything: innocent teacher, brutal murder, decades of mystery, DNA breakthrough. Suspect hiding in plain sight. Sarah gave a press conference at 5 p.m. that day. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. She stood at the podium in her detective suit, badge visible, and spoke clearly. Today, we arrested Frank Morrison, age 68. for the first-degree murder of Maria Gonzalez in October 1982. This arrest was made possible by advances in DNA, technology, and the tireless work of investigators past and present. Maria Gonzalez was 28 years old when she was taken from her family. She was a teacher, a daughter, a fiancée. She deserved to live a full life. While we cannot give that back to her, we can give her family justice. Someone asked, "What took so long?" Sarah paused. The DNA technology we used didn't exist in 1982. CODIS wasn't established until 1998. Genetic genealogy, the method we used to identify Mr. Morrison, only became viable in the last decade. We did the best we could with what we had when we had it. Today, we have answers. Another reporter, how did Morrison evade detection for so long? He didn't do anything to draw attention to himself. No criminal record. No subsequent violent crimes that we're aware of. He lived a normal life. She paused. That's often how it works. Violent offenders don't always fit the profile we expect. But later, alone in her office, Sarah wondered. How had Frank Morrison lived with it? How had he driven a school bus full of children every day? Smiled at parents, attended church functions, raised a daughter, loved a wife, all while knowing what he'd done, what he'd taken. Sociopaths could do it. People with no conscience, no empathy. But was that Frank Morrison? Or had he been a normal man who committed a terrible act in a moment of rage or opportunity, and then spent 42 years burying it so deep he almost believed it never happened? She'd probably never know. Because Frank Morrison, through his attorney, pled not guilty and refused to discuss the case. The trial was set for January 22. David Reyes heard about the arrest from a reporter who tracked him down in Seattle. He was 58 now, graying, living in a small apartment overlooking Puget Sound. He'd never remarried. Never really moved on. When the reporter told him Frank Morrison's name, David went silent for a long moment. Frank Morrison, he repeated. The school bus driver. I met him once. At Maria's funeral. He told me how sorry he was. How much the kids at school would miss her. The reporter scribbled notes. How does it feel, knowing who killed her? David's voice was hollow. I don't know yet. Ask me after the trial. He booked a flight to Tucson the next day. He'd been gone for 42 years. Time to come home. The pre-trial proceedings took months. Frank Morrison's attorney, a public defender named Thomas Wright, fought hard. Challenged the DNA evidence. Challenged the genetic genealogy methodology. Challenged the warrant. Challenged everything he could. But the evidence held. DNA analysis was established science. Genetic genealogy had been upheld in multiple court cases. The warrant was properly obtained. The chain of custody for evidence item 47B was documented and unbroken. In December 2024, Frank Morrison's daughter Emma visited him in jail. Sarah watched the video footage. Later, standard monitoring of attorney rooms wasn't available. But the general visiting area was recorded. Emma was 32. Blonde, like her father, with her mother's gentle features. She sat across from Frank, tears streaming down her face. Did you do it? Her voice was barely audible on the recording. Dad, please. Did you kill that woman? Frank's face was stone. I can't talk about the case. My lawyer? I'm not your lawyer. I'm your daughter. I need to know if my father is a murderer. The other visitors glanced over. Guards shifted. Frank leaned forward. His voice was soft, broken. Emma, sweetheart, I love you. I've always loved you. You're the best thing I ever did. You do it? Silence stretched between them like a chasm. Then, barely a whisper, I'm sorry. Emma stood up so fast her chair fell backward. She walked out. She never visited again. That was the closest Frank Morrison ever came to a confession. The trial began on January 27, 2025. In Pima County Superior Court, Judge Amelia Richardson presiding. The prosecution was led by Catherine Brooks. The defense by Thomas Wright. Sarah sat in the gallery every day. So did David Reyes. So did a handful of reporters and true crime enthusiasts. Maria's former students, now in their 50s, attended. Jennifer Hartley, who'd waved goodbye to Miss Gonzalez that last day, sat in the front row, tissues in her lap. Frank Morrison looked old and small at the defense table. Hard to believe this man had beaten someone to death 42 years ago. But Sarah had learned evil didn't always look evil. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Dr. Patricia Flores testified about the DNA evidence. She explained in clear, simple terms how they'd extracted DNA from the hair roots, how they'd compared it to Frank Morrison's DNA from the coffee cup, how the probability of it being anyone else was statistically impossible. The defense attorney cross-examined. Dr. Flores, isn't it true that DNA can degrade over 42 years? That contamination is possible. Yes, degradation is possible. That's why we use strict protocols. The evidence was properly stored in temperature-controlled conditions. We tested for contamination. The sample was clean and viable, but you can't be 100% certain. In science, we deal in probabilities. The probability that this DNA belongs to Frank Morrison is 99.9%. That's as certain as we get. Dr. Martin Chen, the genetic genealogist, testified next. He walked the jury through the family tree, showed how they'd traced the DNA matches back to common ancestors, how they'd narrowed the pool to 3 candidates, then to Frank Morrison. This isn't science fiction, he said. This is established methodology. It's how we caught the Golden State Killer, the NorCal rapist, hundreds of cold cases across the country. The DNA doesn't lie. The original crime scene investigator, now 81 years old, testified. His memory was fuzzy on details, but he remembered Maria. You don't forget cases like that, he said. Young woman, her whole life ahead. Brutal crime. I've thought about her every year. Detective Moreland had died in 2019, but they entered his detailed case notes into evidence. Sarah read them aloud, his interviews, his theories, his frustration at the lack of leads, his promise to Maria's parents that he'd find the killer. Better late than never, Sarah said quietly to the jury. He'd be glad we kept his promise. The defense tried. Wright argued reasonable doubt, argued that DNA evidence alone wasn't enough without witnesses, without a confession, without direct physical evidence placing Frank at the crime scene. The prosecution wants you to believe that coffee cup. DNA from 2024 proves what happened in 1982. Wright said in his opening statement. But where's the evidence Frank Morrison was at Saguaro National Park that day? Where are the witnesses who saw him with Maria Gonzalez? Where's the murder weapon with his fingerprints? Where's anything except a hair strand that could have transferred innocently? It was a valiant effort. But it wasn't enough, because the prosecution had one more piece of evidence. One more devastating fact. Frank Morrison had been a school bus driver in 1982. His route? It included Davis Elementary School, where Maria taught. He drove past the corner store where Maria stopped every day. His route ended at 4:15 p.m., right around the time Maria disappeared. He knew her routine. He knew her route home. He'd seen her walking hundreds of times, and on October 14, 1982, he'd done something about it. The closing arguments came in mid-February. The courtroom was packed. Catherine Brooks stood before the jury, photos of Maria on a screen behind her. Ladies and gentlemen, Maria Gonzalez was 28 years old when Frank Morrison murdered her. She was 3 months from her wedding. She had students who loved her, parents who adored her, a fiancé who never recovered from losing her. Frank Morrison took all of that away in an act of brutal violence. She clicked through photos, the yellow sundress, the crime scene, the evidence, the DNA charts. The defendant's DNA was literally in Maria's hand when she died. She fought him. She scratched him. She tried to survive. And she left us a gift of evidence that would eventually lead us to her killer, even 42 years later. Brooks's voice rose. Frank Morrison lived 2 blocks from Maria. He drove a school bus past her every single day. He knew when she walked home. He knew she'd be alone. And on October 14, 1982, he followed her, he abducted her. He drove her to Saguaro National Park, and he beat her to death with a rock. She paused. Let it sink in. For 42 years, he lived free while Maria lay in her grave. He got married, had a child, retired, grew old. Maria never got any of that. She never got to marry David, never got to have the 3 children she wanted, never got to see her students graduate. Frank Morrison stole all of that from her. Brooks pointed at Frank, a tease sitting right there. The man whose DNA was clutched in Maria's dying hand. The man who murdered her and then had the audacity to attend her funeral, to bring flowers to her grave. To live 2 blocks from where she lived, like a sick trophy. Her voice softened. You have the power to give Maria justice, to honor her memory. To tell her family and all of us that even after 42 years, the truth matters. Justice matters. Maria Gonzalez mattered. The defense's closing argument was much shorter. Wright stood, looking tired. The prosecution has DNA evidence. I don't dispute that. But is that enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Frank Morrison murdered Maria Gonzalez? There are no witnesses. No confession. No physical evidence placing him at the park. Yes, his DNA was there. But there could be innocent explanations. Contamination, transfer. We'll never know for sure. Because this happened 42 years ago. He looked at the jury. Reasonable doubt, ladies and gentlemen. That's all I'm asking for. If you have reasonable doubt, you must acquit. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Sarah waited in the courthouse hallway with David Reyes. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? At 4:37 p.m. on February 18, 2025, the jury returned. Everyone filed back into the courtroom. Frank Morrison stood, his hands shaking. The judge asked the jury foreman, a middle-aged man in a button-down shirt, for the verdict. In the case of the state of Arizona versus Frank Morrison on the charge of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant. Sarah held her breath. Guilty. David Reyes made a sound half-sob, half-laugh. Relief and grief mixed together. Sarah's eyes burned with tears. Frank Morrison sat down heavily. His face was blank. Maybe he'd known this was coming. Maybe he'd known for 42 years. The judge set sentencing for March 15th, first degree. Murder in Arizona carried life in prison without parole. At 68, Frank Morrison would die in prison. Maria Gonzalez, finally. Head Justice Sarah went to Maria's grave the day after the verdict. It was in El Paso, a 3-hour drive from Tucson. The cemetery was peaceful, with desert mountains in the distance and mesquite trees providing shade. Maria's headstone was simple. White marble. Her name, her dates July 2nd, 1954 to October 14th, 1982. Below that, beloved daughter, teacher, friend, forever in our hearts. Sarah knelt beside the grave. She'd never met Maria, but she felt she knew her. From the case file. From the photos. From the testimonies of people who'd loved her. We got him, Sarah said quietly. It took 42 years, but we got him. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry you didn't get to live your life. But I want you to know you mattered. You still matter. People remember you. Your students remember you. David never forgot you. And now, finally, there's justice. The wind rustled through the mesquite trees. A mourning dove called in the distance. The desert stretched out forever. Beautiful and harsh and unforgiving, Sarah placed a bouquet of flowers yellow, Maria's favorite color, against the headstone. Then she stood, wiped her eyes, and walked back to her car. Behind her, Maria's grave sat in the afternoon sun, no longer the site of an unsolved mystery. Now, finally, it was just a memorial, a place to remember, a place to grieve, a place where justice, delayed but never denied, had finally arrived. The Maria Gonzalez case didn't end with the verdict. It echoed outward like ripples in water, touching lives in ways both expected and surprising. Frank Morrison was sentenced to life without parole on March 15, 2025. He made no statement at his sentencing, showed no remorse. The judge called his crime heinous and unforgivable, and noted that while justice had taken 42 years, it had arrived at last. Frank was sent to Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence. At 68 prison would be his final home. His daughter Emma changed her last name and moved out of state. She wrote a letter to David Reyes never sent, found among her papers years later, apologizing for her father, saying she wished she'd known, saying she wished she could take back every happy memory because they were all built on a lie. David Reyes stayed in Tucson for a month after the trial. He visited Maria's old apartment building, walked her route home, stood at the spot where she'd disappeared. He cried for the first time in decades. Not because he was sad, he'd been sad for 42 years, but because finally he could start to heal. On his last day in Tucson, he drove to Davis Elementary School. It looked different, renovated, expanded, modernized, but it was still there, still teaching children. Still standing, he met with the current principal, a woman in her 40s named Janet Morris. He told her about Maria, about what she'd meant to the school, about her classroom where the red fern grows still sat at Chapter 3 in everyone's memory. 3 months later, Davis Elementary dedicated a small memorial garden to Maria Gonzalez. A plaque with her photo and a simple inscription, Maria Gonzalez, 1950 for 1982. Teacher, friend, forever remembered. She loved her students, and they never forgot her. Jennifer Hartley, the little girl who'd waved goodbye to Miss Gonzalez that last day, tended the dedication ceremony. She was 51 now, with children of her own. She placed a single yellow rose at the memorial. "I think about her all the time," Jennifer told a reporter covering the ceremony. "I'm a teacher now myself, elementary school. And I try to be the kind of teacher she was, the kind who makes kids feel safe and valued." That's her legacy. Not how she died, but how she lived. The Maria Gonzalez case had another impact. It breathed new life into Tucson's cold case unit. The publicity from the arrest led to increased funding to new detective positions and a systematic review of every unsolved case with preserved DNA evidence. Over the following year, 3 more cold cases were solved. A 1991 rape case DNA match through CODIS. A 1977 murder genetic genealogy identified the killer, who died in 2015, but the family finally had answers. A 1988 missing person case remains identified through genetic genealogy, allowing a daughter to bury her mother after 37 years. Detective Sarah Chen became something of a celebrity in law enforcement circles. She spoke at conferences about cold case investigation, about genetic genealogy, about never giving up on victims. She always ended her presentations the same way. Maria Gonzalez waited 42 years for justice. Some victims wait longer. Some never get it. But every single one of them deserves the same effort, the same dedication, the same promise. We will not forget you. We will not stop looking. We will not rest until we give you peace. At one conference, an older woman approached Sarah afterward. She was in her 70s, well-dressed with kind eyes. Detective Chen, I wanted to thank you. My sister was murdered in 1979. They never found who did it. But hearing you speak, knowing people like you are still working on these cases, it means more than you know. Sarah squeezed her hand. What was your sister's name? Rebecca. Rebecca Walsh. She was 23. A nurse, Sarah wrote it down. Later, she pulled the Rebecca Walsh case file. Murder, 1979, unsolved. DNA evidence preserved but never tested against modern databases. She added it to her list because that's what you did. You remembered. You investigated. You never gave up. For every Maria Gonzalez who got justice, there were dozens more waiting. Hundreds, thousands, cold cases stacked in evidence rooms across the country. Victims' names on files turning yellow with age. But DNA technology kept improving. Genetic genealogy kept advancing. And detectives like Sarah Chen kept working. Justice might be delayed, but it was never impossible. On October 14, 2025, the 43rd anniversary of Maria's death, small group gathered at her grave in El Paso. David Reyes, now 59. Detective Sarah Chen, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, Jennifer Hartley, and 2 other former students of Maria's, a reporter from the Tucson Star, who'd covered the case extensively. They stood in silence for a moment. The desert wind moving through the cemetery. The mountains standing eternal in the distance. David spoke first. His voice was steady. Maria, I've spent 43 years missing you. Wondering what our life would have been like. What our children would have looked like. What jokes you'd tell at the dinner table. What songs you'd sing while cooking. He paused. I can't get that back. Nobody can. But I can promise you this, you're not forgotten. You never will be. You mattered then. You matter now. And what happened to you? ... There's justice now. Finally, Sarah added. You fought your killer. Even in your last moments, you fought. You left evidence that eventually brought him down. You saved yourself a cross for decades. That's not nothing. That's extraordinary. Jennifer said simply, thank you for being my teacher, for making school feel safe. I became a teacher because of you. So did Melissa, my classmate. You're still teaching people, Miss Gonzalez. Even now, they placed flowers. Yellow ones. Maria's favorite as they walked back to their cars. David turned to Sarah. Thank you, he said, for not giving up. For caring about a woman you never met. Sarah shook her head. I may never have met her, but I knew her. From her case file. From her students. From everyone who loved her. And I knew she deserved justice. She got it. Because of you. No, Sarah said. Because of her. Because she fought. Because she left evidence. Because she held on just long enough to tell us who did it, even if we didn't understand the message for 42 years. They shook hands. David drove back to Seattle that afternoon. Sarah returned to Tucson, to her desk, to her stack of cold case files. Rebecca Walsh, 1979. Sarah opened the file, started reading another victim, another family waiting, another promise to keep. The work never ended. But then, neither did hope. 5 years later, in 2030, Frank Morrison died in prison. Heart attack, age 73. The news was a footnote in the Tucson Star. Most people had forgotten about him by then, but they remembered. Maria Gonzalez. Davis Elementary's Memorial Garden became a place students visited. Teachers used her story carefully, age-appropriately, to talk about safety, kindness, remembering people who came before. The yellow roses planted in her honor bloomed every spring, bright and beautiful against the desert landscape. David Reyes died in 2034 at age 68. Heart failure. He was cremated, and his ashes were buried next to Maria's grave in El Paso. His will specified it, "So I can finally be with her," he'd written, "even if it's 49 years late." Detective Sarah Chen retired in 2042 at age 54. By then, she'd solved 43 cold cases. Maria Gonzalez was her first. Also her most important. At her retirement party, someone asked which case she was most proud of. "The one where a 20-year-old teacher waited 42 years for justice," Sarah said. "Because she taught me something important. It's never too late. As long as evidence exists, as long as someone cares, as long as we keep searching, it's never too late." The technology kept improving. By 2045, DNA analysis that took weeks in 2024 took minutes. Genetic genealogy that required months of research was automated. Cold cases that seemed impossible in the 1980s were solved routinely. Hundreds of families got closure. Hundreds of victims got justice. Hundreds of killers who'd thought they'd gotten away with murder learned otherwise. And it all traced back, in some small way, 2-3 strands of hair clutched in a dying woman's hand. To evidence item 47B, to Maria Gonzalez, who fought back even as she was dying, who left a message for the future even though she didn't know anyone would be able to read it. Her death was a tragedy, but the justice that followed, delayed, yes, but inevitable, that was something else. That was proof that the dead are not forgotten. That evil does not go unpunished forever. That somewhere, someone is always keeping the promise. We will find the truth. We will bring you home. We will make sure you're remembered not just as a victim, but as a person. Maria Gonzalez, July 2, 1954, to October 14, 1982. Teacher. Daughter, fiancé, friend. Fighter forever remembered in the desert night. A morning dove calls. The wind moves through saguaro cacti, standing like sentinels. Stars shine in the infinite darkness. And in a cemetery in El Paso, yellow roses bloom on a grave that's no longer marked by questions, but by answers. Justice came slowly, but it came. And in the end, that's what matters most.